there's a saying, either it's a hadith or a saying of a scholar, which says that there are different levels of iman. Iman is the belief, the belief that they have in the heart. There's different levels. So for example, if someone has taqwa in Allah, has fear of Allah, real fear. When I say fear, I mean he's aware of the consequence of what will happen to him if he commits a sin.
Who determines these consequences?
God determines.
Okay, God determines.
So when he fears Allah, this is called the taqwa. Okay. The amount of amount of iman you have, it determines that.
God has
so
revealed to us
let me finish. Let me finish the point here.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that a person with taqwa and iman, if he commits a sin, it is as if a mountain has been basically he's carrying a weight as a mountain, as big as a mountain. Yes, and there are people whose iman is so low that even if he's committed a major sin or a sin that is great in the eyes of the Creator, yes, he just chooses as if there is a fly on his nose.
Okay.
So that's what I'm telling you. There are different kinds of people.
Okay.
There are people who are very aware of the sins,
So
and for them it is a very major thing, like as big as mountains. And there are people who would just commit sins, like shooing away a fly on the nose.
Okay, so in Christianity it's very different. God doesn't look at any sin as a fly on the nose.
Okay.
Right?
So every sin is major.
Every sin is major.
Okay.
To God, every sin is a rejection of His law. Right? Every sin is a transgression of His law, and because God is holy, He must punish every sin.
Yet He has given different punishments for different.
That's for communal purposes,
Communal purposes.
Yes, civil purposes.
Yeah, but that's
in
from
the Old
God.
Testament,
But that's from
in
God.
the Old Testament, under the Jewish law in the land of Israel, they had certain roles, and there were sacrifices for some sins, but not for others, for community purposes. But the
Caleb,
eternal
you know what that tells us?
The eternal consequences for any sin is the same according to the Bible,
Okay.
and that is hell
What that tells us, that the reason the law in the Old Testament are different punishments for different sins, what does it tell you?
It tells you that different sins had different impacts on society.
No, the different consequences were because the sins were categorized differently.
No, that was because they had different effects on society.
That's what I'm telling you. The reason God had different consequences, for example, there's a capital offense, then you have capital punishment. But if somebody steals an apple, you are not going to stone them to death, are you? In the Old Testament law.
Yeah, according to Old Testament law, I'd have to
because the new
that particular dilemma.
Yeah. Unfortunately, for the New Testament law, you guys have no law.
No, because
there's
we're
no
not meant to be a civil government.
But that's what I'm saying. You as a Christian can never be a ruler based on the Bible.
Well, no, well,
you have to rely on the law of the land or on the law of the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that.
You know what it tells me?
I don't have a problem with that.
So, but you still wouldn't consider.
It's okay.
But if you were punishing them based on the law of the Old Testament, are you saying you would reintroduce stoning?
I'd have to say, like I said to you before, I'm not sure what I would do.
You would reintroduce stoning to death?
And I would have to consider it and ponder it if I was.
Because this is a major thing, you know, this is major.
When the Old Testament said that when the king, before he was to take the throne, he was to read through the law, and which implies that he was to think about his role as king. Now, if I was to be given the role of a king, I would have to think about that, and I haven't thought about it, so I can't really answer directly.
What do you think of the passages in the Old Testament which says that you can be forgiven without the shedding of blood?
Are you talking about like sacrifice and offerings I have not desired? Is that the passage you're referring to?
No, not unintentional.
Okay, show me the...
Okay, for example, it says here, there's quite a few actually. There's one in 2 Samuel 12 to 13. It says that, then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die.
Yeah, but I think ultimately he still participated. He still participated in the sacrifices and also the yearly Day of Atonement.
Stop raining, right?
Yeah.
My hand is paining now. There you go. It's carrying the umbrella for no reason.
Okay, no worries.
All right.
Thanks.
Yeah, so we both are getting old.
Yeah. Maybe I'll answer this and then we'll call it quits, or what do you want to do? You want to keep going?
It's entirely up to you.
Yeah, I'll just answer this.
I can go on until I'm exhausted.
No.
And I'll tell you when that happens.
Conclusion is this.
No, we don't want your conclusion, Asif.
Torah,
Asif.
Zabur and Injil, they all are given by Allah. So he is accusing Allah by giving.
Let's go on.
He doesn't understand that, unfortunately.
He is accusing Allah.
So
That's why.
That wasn't my conclusion, might be yours, but not mine. So what I'm saying is that with regards to David,
why don't you make your statement and I'll make mine, or do you want me to do mine first?
no, what I'm saying, can you, before we make the statement, can you respond to that once again, because I didn't hear your response.
So what I was trying to say
it
is
says
that-
here, then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord.
Yeah.
Okay, now this is the intentional sin.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
And Nathan replied to him, the Lord has taken away your sin, you are not going to die. What does that mean?
So I would argue that.
Taken away your sin and not going to die. Explain that.
So first of all, I would say that the immediate consequences, it seems to be, just on top of my head and you reading that, it seems to be that God was going to punish him and kill him, but he decided not to and took away his sin. For what reason, I'm not shown. But however,
Shall I tell you?
The eternal, you can tell me in a minute, but the eternal consequences, I think, would have been covered by the Day of Atonement described.
There's
in
no
Leviticus
mention
16.
of any sacrifice. Okay?
Yeah, but there is always a generic.
Do you remember the sin that
consequence
David
for all
committed?
the sins.
Do you remember the
committed
sin?
Adultery, yeah.
Adultery with Bathsheba? Do you
Yeah.
remember that?
Yeah.
Who was punished in that?
I think that he does talk about sacrifice being made for him.
No,
at the end
in
of
that
his
there's no
psalm.
mention of sacrifice. He was,
his psalm
in
it
fact, he
does.
was forgiven. But,
Yeah, but it does say
instead of him, who was punished? Do you remember?
It does say that a plague was coming upon from Israel, wasn't it? Something like that? Tell me what it is.
His wives were punished. Plural, wives were punished, yes.
I'm not
And
familiar
his
with that.
child
Where
was
does it say that?
killed.
Oh, the son died, yeah. The
Yes,
son died.
and
yeah.
his wife-
I don't know if his son was
And,
punished.
and you know what?
Oh, his wife.
God in that passage,
read me the
yeah,
verse.
I'll read the
Read me
verse.
the
God
verse.
in that passage said, you have committed the sin in secret, the sin of adultery,
Yeah.
but I will make, basically your wife should be punished in
You
this,
have to read me
in
the
the way,
verse.
okay, I'll read the passage,
verse.
no
Read
problem.
the verse.
So,
I was thinking of a different thing that he did. Actually.
open 2 Samuel 12:13.
I can't. I got.
You want,
Let me open the Bible. All right?
Okay, yeah.
Let me get my phone.
You need a brain to understand the word of God.
Second. 2 Samuel 12. Did you say?
yeah.
Says, Ma ana Bukhari, I'm a jahil.
Let me bring up the passage about David sinning.
To understand the word of God.
It's getting cold, isn't it? 12 verse what? Okay. Out of your own household I'm going to bring calamity upon you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to
that's the
one.
one.
Yeah, so the punish. So
Carry
it's
on
not the
reading.
wives
Just
being
read
punished.
it. Read it.
Yeah, so before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you. That was his son Absalom. And he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before Israel. Yeah.
What do you make of that? Do you think that is fair to punish his wives for his sin, and he's forgiven?
Well, he's not punishing his wives.
Well,
It's a punishment.
why are the
punishment is upon him? Because
why is God
somebody else is sleeping with his wives?
exactly? So who's getting punished, him or the wives?
Him?
And not the wives?
No, they probably did it willingly. How do we know they didn't do it willingly?
Are you saying David's wives were adulteresses?
I don't know.
Oh my God, these guys are crazy.
Honestly,
You
I'd
would
have
go
to
to
think
any
about
length to.
But I'd have to think about that passage.
No,
But
no.
it's a
It
good one.
says very clearly.
Yeah, it's a good passage. I have to think
It says
about
very clearly
Yeah.
that I will make the people close to you sleep with your wives in broad daylight.
Yeah.
Okay. And if you
Yeah,
think
that's
that
right,
is,
that's right.
if you think his wives were whores and they were
I'd have to think about it.
adulterous, no, there's nothing to think. It's very clear that, bro.
No, there's always
okay.
there'll be an answer.
And then it goes on to say that he will kill his child as well. Do you think it's fair on the child and the wives?
Well, it's not like the child. Was it born? Was it a stillborn? No, I think it was born.
Regardless, God specifically says the reason your child died is because of this punishment.
Yeah, look, it's his
Do you think that's fair?
It's definitely a punishment for him, whether or not.
I know it's a
fair.
punishment. Look, I'm not saying it's not a punishment for him as a as him being suffering mentally. Mental is a mental trauma for him.
Yeah, it would be,
yes,
yeah.
but not a physical punishment.
Yeah.
Okay, shall we agree on that?
Yeah, sure.
Good. So his wives were basically thrown into adultery, and his child was killed.
Yeah.
But he was not touched
Yeah.
physically. His wives were physically punished. His child was physically punished, but he was not physically punished.
So,
he was
yeah, I
only
don't-
mentally maybe
I think,
traumatized by
first of
that.
all, he's definitely was a punishment for him. Whether or not it was a punishment for them, I would have to think about and have to look at.
And you know what? David was actually forgiven. It says here, the Lord has taken away your sin. Taken
Yeah.
away your sin means you're forgiven.
Yeah.
And then he says, you are
on
not
the
going to
basis
die.
of the forgiveness,
Remember,
yeah.
you are not going to die means not going to die. He didn't mean obviously in a physical death,
Yeah.
but spiritually not going to die.
Yeah.
And that only happens to people whose sins are forgiven.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So, and there's no mention of any sacrifice here.
Well, yeah, but there is always the Day of Atonement in Leviticus 16, which would have been covering all of the sins.
What, the
of Israel.
Passover?
No, Leviticus 16. No, not the Passover. That's
Is that for intentional sin or unintentional sins?
all sins.
So, but hold on.
When we say-
You're telling me for
Yeah, but when
if
we
somebody,
say intentional sin and unintentional sin, if you're using the biblical classification of what that is,
yeah, Leviticus 14, I believe, yeah, where it talks about the unintentional.
Numbers 15.
No, Leviticus 14 as well, when it talks about the sacrifices for the unintentional sins.
that's Leviticus, that's Numbers 15. I think you're talking about.
And Leviticus 14. Okay, anyway, what I'm saying is this. In this passage,
Yeah, look,
okay,
honestly, I have to think about that.
hold on.
passage, yeah.
Earlier, remember I asked you what will happen to an adulteress, and you said it'll be stoned to death.
Yeah.
So if I asked you, if somebody commits an adultery in the time of David,
If God decreed for him to be forgiven, then that's.
let me finish. If someone committed adultery in the time of David,
punishment
and
was
David is the king, he was the king, right?
Yeah.
David was the king,
Yeah.
and he would rule by the law of God.
Yeah, the punishment is death.
The punishment is stoning by death.
Yeah, definitely.
However, when David himself did it,
Yeah.
the king,
Yeah.
he was forgiven.
Yeah, but that's
And
up
to me,
God
that
if
is
he
the
wants to
greatest
forgive.
injustice of God.
If God wants to forgive, he can.
Is God being unjust here or not?
Well, no, because forgiveness is always on the basis of the atonement.
No, there's no atonement here.
Yeah,
He was
it might not be
forgiven.
mentioned there, but there is always the
So
general
you're just
atonement over all
so
of sin.
David's wives were punished, his child was punished, but he wasn't punished.
Look,
Do you not see that passage? You have
I'm
read
happy
it
to sit
yourself.
here and discuss this.
You have read it yourself. If you go home and you can look it up. Earlier I told you that Allah, if He wishes to forgive someone, He can forgive someone.
Yeah, but-
now you have agreed, yes, if God had decreed it, then it'll happen. So you, in fact, wait a
Leviticus
minute.
16
Wait a minute,
clearly
Caleb.
states
Caleb.
that all of
When
the
I brought the
sins-
passage
You've been
from the
talking a lot.
Bible,
I'd
when
like
the
to
passage
respond.
came to the Bible, you immediately said, if God had decreed for him to be forgiven, he's forgiven.
Yeah.
And you had no issues with that.
Yeah, I'd like
That
to-
is exactly what the Muslims believe.
Yeah, I know, but I'm not saying
Alhamdulillah.
that forgiveness is given independent of the atonement system that was
Well,
there
unless you
in
can prove to
Israel.
me atonement here is mentioned.
Leviticus 16 is very clear that every single year
Not
there
for
was
adultery.
An atonement for all of
Not
the sins.
adultery.
Yes,
Adultery
included.
means punishment by
Adultery
death,
included.
by stoning. It's very clear.
Yeah, but there's still an atonement for it. There's still an
So
atonement.
so you're telling me when God says the punishment for adultery is stoning to death, you're telling me, Caleb,
yeah.
hold on. Are you telling me that if somebody commits adultery during the time of David, they should not be going based on the Old Testament law, or they should be going based on with regards to the consequence of adultery?
Yeah. So I would say that, first of all, and if I'm allowed to reply to you without interruption.
Yeah.
So first of all, when the sacrifices always were a representation of what Jesus did on the cross for us, right? And it says that he was crucified before the foundation of the world. So before the foundation of the world, God always had the intention of Jesus taking the punishment for our sins. All
very
these
unjust,
sacrifices pointed to that. The sacrifice of the Old Testament pointed to that. Leviticus 16, as I said, was a general atonement for the sins of Israel and anyone else who wanted to join themselves to Israel. And that covered all sins. So any basis that God would forgive David was based upon what Jesus would have done on the cross in the future. Okay. So because that's what the sacrifice.
So can we apply that same ruling for all the adulteresses during the time of the Old Testament law?
If they repented before they were executed, because when we talk about the stoning to death,
yes,
that's the civil law.
Based on God or based on God?
What God has decreed, He's
okay,
decreed that to be the civil law, right?
Was it to be applied or not to be applied?
Well, if the general rule was that it would be applied, but if God intervened, then God was allowed to intervene.
Okay, so if God decreed someone in Islam to be forgiven, that's okay, right?
No, not without the basis of atonement.
Why do you have the double standards? Just now you said it's okay.
Hang on, if you're talking about from the punishment of being stoned, then I guess that's
okay,
fine for God to intervene
for a person,
on that. But if you're talking about the eternal consequences of the adultery, no.
But you told me sin is so severe that it cannot be forgiven except by the shedding of blood.
That's correct.
That's what earlier. Yeah. But now David is forgiven without the shedding of blood.
Where you're misunderstanding actually.
No, you're telling me that the sin that was in the done in the temple was for every sin, including the ones which were major sins. So would that include murder as well?
Just state your point again.
Okay, my point is this: sins which are major, capital sins, capital offenses, according to the Old Testament law, means capital punishment. For example, if you commit
So we're talking
murder,
about the civil law here. We're not talking about eternity.
no, I'm talking about the law of God.
No, we're talking about
Whether
the
you call it civil
the
or whether you
civil
call
law
it,
of God that
it's
was
a
to
law
be
of God.
administered in Israel.
Regardless, it's the law of God.
Okay.
It's a command from God.
Yeah, but
okay?
we're talking about the punishment. When we're talking about the punishment, we're talking about the civil law that God instituted in the kingdom of Israel.
Yeah, where David was.
So we're not talking
where
about
David
the eternal
was.
consequences of sin.
No, I'm talking. Yes, I'm talking. Obviously, I'm talking about the worldly consequence.
Okay.
I'm not talking about the consequence after the day of judgment.
Let's get that clear.
Yes, so that's clear. So if somebody committed a crime like murder,
Yep.
yes, can they just sacrifice an animal and get away with it?
Okay, not under the Mosaic law.
Yes. If they commit adultery, can they just sacrifice an animal and get away with it?
No, they would have to be stoned to death. That's the
Okay,
punishment.
and that is my question. Why was David not stoned to death?
Because God intervened.
Which means God is able to forgive without the shedding of blood.
Okay, if we're talking about civil law, right, the punishment, God is able to pardon someone from the punishment and not give them that stoning to death that they deserve under the civil law. God is able to do that. If we're talking about the eternal consequences of sin, God is not able to do that. He has declared very clearly that He is requiring.
All right, let's read Ezekiel 33 because that goes against what you just said.
Okay.
It says here, and if I say to a wicked person, you will surely die, but they then turn away from their sin and do what is just and right. If they give back what they took in pledges for a loan, return what they have stolen, follow the decrees that give life and do no evil.
Is there anything about adultery in there?
Hold on. That person will surely live. They will not die. So you know where this says live and die? This is about the eternal. This is about, that's why I told you about David when he says, when Nathan told David that your sins are forgiven and that you will not die, it's talking about the eternal death.
No, it's not.
So you're telling me David didn't die?
No, he died eventually, physically, but
when he says you will not die means what?
I think it's talking about the context of being stoned for adultery.
No, I don't think you understand that. You do not realize that when he says you will not die, just like in Ezekiel it says you will surely live. And in Ezekiel it's not about David. It's a generic statement.
Yeah,
God saying. God is saying that if you have actually, if they give back what they took as a pledge. So, for example, if they broke a pledge and they gave it back, or they took a loan and they gave it back, and if they've stolen and they've given it back, and they do no evil, that person will surely live. They will not die. None of the sins of that person committed will be remembered against them. They have done what is just and right. They will surely live.
Yeah, but the context there.
This is eternal.
Yeah, but
not a communal.
So
the context is that they can ask God for repentance. Yeah, sure.
Let me talk.
Go on, talk.
So whenever there is forgiveness in Israel, right, there is always the overshadowing issue that Christ, there were sacrifices for sins, that there was the Day of Atonement for all sin, which pointed to what Jesus would do, which was for every sin. Jesus died on the cross for all our sins. So
Jesus wasn't there, Ezekiel time.
Yeah, I know, but it was always foreshadowed by the sacrifices of the Old Testament.
No, it's not.
Pointing forward
it's
to
not.
Christ.
That was animal sacrifice. This is human sacrifice. Can't be foreshadowing.
Jesus himself said that the Passover is near. And
Lamb of God. Does it mean he's an animal? Seriously, man, come on.
Jesus says that, as you know, the Passover is near and the Son of Man will be handed over and will be crucified. He says that.
Jesus didn't die on the Passover day.
No, he did actually.
Oh, sorry, he didn't pass. The one you're talking about is Yom Kippur. He didn't die on the Yom Kippur. But the ones about the animal sacrifices?
I
yes.
just quoted Jesus.
But you mentioned Passover, that's why.
Because all these sacrifices pointed to what Jesus was going to do on the cross.
It's not,
So
actually.
whenever there's forgiveness in the Old Testament, it's not just on the basis of God pardoning without any justification.
Let me ask
you.
It's
always on the basis of what Jesus did on the cross.
It is pardoning of David, clearly. Your sins will be forgiven and you will live. Sorry, you will not die.
In fact, when you read, when you read that passage in where he writes the psalm about his forgiveness, and he says that sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a broken spirit and a contrite.
Oh, but I wasn't talking about that. I was talking about his adultery.
But he at the end of that passage, he says, "Then I will offer a sacrifice." So he clearly offered a sacrifice for his sin.
Not for the Bathsheba.
No, he did.
Where?
He did.
Where? Where did he? But the thing, are you saying he was forgiven before the sacrifice?
No, he was